Hello, hello. I guess I'm live and I'm just gonna post it again to Twitter because you can't post to Twitter often enough when you're streaming. Hello, Toffin, good to see you. Thanks for joining. We're gonna have a lot of stuff to talk about today. Let me know if the audio is fine or if it isn't. I haven't streamed in quite some time. Oh, that's interesting. I just noticed that on Twitter, if you want to retweet something, it's actually called repost now and not retweet. Hey Kevin, good to see you. Kevin is a maintainer of TanStack table, and he's actually asked a good question right now, which I'm also going to go into about version 5 and how things are going to work. Let me just quickly then repost the announcement that we're live. Come join us. Okay, cool. If you want to do me a favor and retweet something, it would be, the announcement would be this tweet. And then I will get started any second. Of course, if you have further questions or something comes to your mind, feel free to just post it in the chat. I'll do my best to answer all the questions that you have on the new major version, because that's what we're here for. Otherwise, my plan is just to go through the change logs and maybe show off some of the new things or why we're doing things. Try to explain the reasoning behind the changes, because believe it or not, all the changes have a reason. Maybe well, we think it's a good reason to do the changes, otherwise we wouldn't be doing them. So yeah, of course, if you think they are not good changes, also let me know, because we are still in beta and there's still time to change it back or change it to something different. It's totally possible that we're missing something. Hi, yeah, if you want to watch it live, you can do it now. Otherwise, I'll upload it to YouTube later. And obviously, you can always reach out to me on Twitter or Discord or wherever if you have further questions, and we can always discuss the changes that we're making. As I said, now is the time to get involved if you're using TanStack query and if you want to influence the direction we're going. I'm happy to get as much feedback as possible, because if you remember the version 4 release, I certainly remember the version 4 release, it was more like there was not much feedback on the alpha and beta versions, and then we released it, and on the day of the release there was a bit of a, well, not on the day of the release, but soon after the release there was a bit of a backlash, like why is this working this way, stuff like that, which is okay. That's what we're having version 5 for, to actually also fix that. Okay, then let me just see if I can pull something up, and I'll share my screen any second. Just gonna close this. All right, let's see if we can get this up. Yeah, here we are. Cool. First question from the chat from Ramdude. What do you think of Ryan's opinion that you should remove the callbacks from user mutation as well? Ryan, I thought you meant Ryan Carniato there for a second. I haven't seen that that opinion. Very interesting. Let me just quickly pull it up then. I'd recommend they also remove. What? This is from 16th. This was from the day before yesterday. Interesting. I haven't even seen this. Like, what is that? I get no notifications for quote tweets apparently. This is cool. So first answer, no, we're not going to remove them. Whatever this tweet says, we're not going to remove them. I need some time to read this actually. And I found out other things in this article as a reason why we didn't use effect is the bug-free way to do it. Telling me it was unusable without them. Okay. I'd recommend they also remove the callbacks from use mutation for all the same reasons and interruptions as others. use effects, deuse, all of these things. So there are different reasons why we I mean, we can go into this actually. It's one of the things on the list anyways. So let's start with that. By the way, the docs are on query v5. If you go to latest, you'll actually go to version 4, because latest at the moment redirects to version 4, the latest stable version. But you can switch to version 5 in the drop down here that lets you select the version next to the one that lets you select the framework. And then we can go to migrating to version 5. And then I think one of the points must be about the callbacks. Yeah, so callbacks and use query have been removed. On success, on error, and on settle have been removed from queries. They haven't been touched for mutations. This was like, when I announced this, this was the biggest concern that people had, that, oh my god, I use them every day, please don't remove them. And they thought we'd remove it for mutations as well, which we're not going to. Because I think, so the big difference between mutations and queries is that mutations are triggered imperatively. And when you trigger something imperatively, you are already in this world of doing a side effect. And then it actually kind of makes sense to await this side effect and then do something afterwards, depending on if it worked or if it didn't work. But queries run automatically, and sometimes you change a query and the query key and you get new data, but you're not actually making a fetch request, or you're not actually running the query function. This is what's part of the caching that React Query does. So that's where kind of the misconceptions were about when does the callback actually fire and when doesn't it fire. And it was kind of, I think, a bit, difficult to understand and also difficult to teach. And it was just not very intuitive. And we want the API to be as intuitive as possible. And that's probably also the reason why we removed it. I don't want to go too much into this topic because I've written a separate blog post about this anyways, which I'm also going to post so that you can read it later if you haven't read it already. And then, I think I disagree with Ryan's opinion here. I'd need to see if there's something more. Need to read all the comments here. So no, we're not going to remove them from mutations. Everybody loves the callbacks on mutations. Everybody uses them. And there's no bugs in them, right? It's just a better or a kind of different API in comparison to like doing things with use effect, which you can also do, right? You can also call mutateAsync and do try catch and things like that manually. So you don't need to use the callbacks if you don't want to, and they work exactly the same as the other ways, which wasn't the case for the callbacks on the queries. So that's where the difference comes in, and that's why we've removed them for one part of the APIs, but not the others. Okay, one more question from the chat. Do you have any tips for syncing optimistic mutations across multiple cache keys? For example, a query for a list of items and then a query for an individual list of items. So if you, optimistic mutations are difficult, but we have a new API for optimistic mutations in version 5, which we can also go into, but I don't think that it would solve this specific use case, because as soon as you have multiple queries on the screen that are affected by the same mutation, you actually need to write to the query cache and write the same entry into the cache in order to see it everywhere. And what you can use is query client set queries data, where you say, okay, I want to write to my list and to my individual item at the same time. But then those probably have different structures, so you need to make additional checks in the update function, and that's also not the most ergonomic way. So maybe the new feature about optimistic updates that we have can help if you're using it in the same UI and you can just render the variables. I'm going to go into details on that as well when we're showing off the new features. Another question from Projammer: any progress on the local storage persister plus React router loader issue? I don't know. Maybe post the issue, or is there an issue in React Query about this? I don't know. I haven't had much time this week to look into the open issues, sadly. Okay, another question in the chat. We rely heavily on use query callbacks, and it would be hard to upgrade, but I do understand because of them. But for mutations, why is the suggested method to use mutate with callbacks versus mutateAsync? Yeah, sorry that you're using the callbacks on use query. That's definitely, unfortunate, because it is a buggy way to use them, and maybe you haven't seen the bugs yet, but what others have reported is that it does introduce a couple of issues, especially in edge cases. So I hope you understand why we're removing them. For mutations, I personally suggest mutate with the callbacks over mutateAsync, because mutateAsync returns back the promise. And if you don't try catch that promise and there is an error, you get an unhandled promise rejection. Actually, someone asked me this question today as well, and the answer is in the mutations. There's like a gotcha section or something about this topic, mutate or mutateAsync. Yeah, I think the answer should be in here. And it's basically about if you use mutateAsync and you don't need the return value, then it's definitely unnecessary. But if you do need the return value, then you need to like do a try catch around it, even if you don't need the error, right? Even if you don't want to do anything if there's an error. But if you don't do that, the promise will bubble up, and then you'll get an unhandled promise rejection, and that's kind of like annoying a bit. So mutate solves that, because mutate internally catches all the errors. MutateAsync is good for calling toast to display different toast statuses. Yeah, if you're using something like what's it called? React Hot Toast, I think they have a promise-based API, right? I think Moshifan is right. Hello, by the way, good to see you again. Moshifan works on React Hook Form. And yeah, React Hot Toast has a promise-based API, and then you can pass the promise in there. I think toast.promise, and this works well with mutateAsync probably. Yep. Okay, said you were going to try an idea at the end of the week. Oh yes, I remember. End of the week. Is it already end of the week? I'm going to look into it tomorrow. I remember we talked on Twitter, and we also talked on the Discord, I guess. And yeah, sorry about that. I think I kind of forgot about it, but I do have the idea is still somewhere in my head, so I'm going to get to it, and I'll get back to you. Okay. Cool. All right. About the the question about the UI.dev course. I know that there will be an update on version 5, and I'm probably able to tell you a bit more about that in a couple of weeks or months when we actually have a release of version 5. Hello, Jared Kenny. I've replaced Redux-like state management solutions in my React Native apps entirely with React Query. Am I insane? Well, no, I don't think so. It depends on what you're doing with it. I mean, if you have synchronous state that you're writing to it, then what happens is that React. I mean, there are ways to make React Query work with synchronous state as well, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's not made for it. And it's kind of like doing the same mistake all over again. We put everything in Redux, our synchronous and asynchronous state, and then we're having a bad time because it's not optimized to do both things. And now we have React Query, which is optimized to do the async stuff, and then we do synchronous stuff with it, and it's also not so good. So I would, my personal, recommendation is to use specific tools for the jobs that they are meant to do. And my personal favorite combo is React Query for async state and Zustand for synchronous state if there is something that I really need globally and that I can't handle any differently. All right. Let's go on. Hi, Leonard. Hello from Japan. Hi, good to see you. Wow, I'm reaching out to Japan here from Austria. That's amazing. You're starting to use Suspense query, but enabled was missing. How would you suggest refactoring this? Yes, that's a good point. We can go into this really quickly because that's also on my list, anyways. Sorry if this is a bit chaotic. I don't want to miss any of the questions in the chat. I think it's quite important to go all of them. And if we haven't covered anything, then I'll just go over the migration path at the end and just show off all the rest that is working. So let's talk about use suspense query for a second. I have prepared a TypeScript playground where we're importing the types of the beta version, so we are getting the latest TypeScript versions. And this is just a little thing that you need to do in the TypeScript playground as long as we're in beta. We also need to import the types from the query core because TanStack React Query re-exports the core, and if we don't have the types of the core, then also in beta, then we have kind of a types version mismatch between the query core and React Query. So this is just to make the TypeScript playground work with that. Why does use suspense query not have an enabled option? Well, so first of all, we do have a new use suspense query hook, right? Maybe this is suspense query. Maybe this is kind of like one of the new things of the APIs that we're having. We're now no longer having this as an experimental flag or feature on use query. We have a dedicated use suspense query hook that will, right now it still works the same as it did before, but in the future we probably hopefully have an easier time to integrate with maybe a suspense cache or maybe with additional features like the use hook from use query and so on, from React itself, or maybe we can integrate with APIs like start transition when we're switching from one query to the other and so on. So just to have a first class support for this, we're having a separate hook. And the other thing that we're having is this will help us with a specific TypeScript thing as well, which is pretty cool because data will always be defined once the suspense query reads the data, because there is no loading state that's handled by the suspense boundary, and there is no error state because that's handled by error boundaries. So what happens is that when you go past use suspense query, data will always be defined, and we can quickly put this in the playground here, and we can just define the async function fetch post with a post ID, and it's going to return post ID, let's return promise.resolve post ID +5 or whatever, and post ID is a number, obviously. And then we're going to import use suspense query from here, and then we do like, I don't know, 3 and then 3 in here. And what should happen here is that data, let's do it like this. Why is this not working? Is this like the wrong thing? No, this is how you should do this, right? TypeScript playground letting me down, not showing the type inference here. Doo-doo-dum. Okay, well I thought this would work. Okay, well let's do it the other way. Let's do query and then query.data. Okay, here it says query.data is a number. That's good. Yeah, so now it works. Okay, so query.data is a number. And usually if you do this with normal use query, you will get a number or undefined. That's one of the type improvements that we have on this. But this also means that we cannot support an enabled option. So if you do enabled, I don't know, false or true, it doesn't work because use suspense query doesn't have an enabled option. And the reason is because if you do enabled, like, I don't know, math.random greater 0.5 or something, then there is no way for us to actually do this discrimination, because if you have a query observer here that is disabled, then you won't have that guarantee that data is defined after you pass basically the suspense and the error handling of it. So what's the way to go past this? Well, there are actually two ways to do this. One of them is to rely on component composition, and that's actually what you have to do with Suspense anyways, especially when you think about Suspense on the server, when you want separate Suspense boundaries to stream in from Next.js, for example. Then you want to place granular Suspense boundaries anyways, and the only way to avoid waterfalls with use Suspense query is to do component composition anyways. So for example, if we take another query and we do query 2 and we do like a different ID and we fetch something different and we have this in the same component, then we are actually creating a fetch waterfall that we don't want. So if you do this with normal use query, what happens is that this will fetch and this will fetch, they will both fetch at the same time, and then they will resolve and data will just render. But if you do this with Suspense, what happens is that the first query renders, then the component suspends and it fetches only the first query, and after it is done, it goes here, and then it will start to fetch the second query. So that's just the way Suspense works. The way you handle this is by not calling a suspending thing twice in the same component. I actually also have a blog post on this. I think it's called Seeding the Query Cache. Yeah, it actually shows Suspense waterfalls. So that is the thing where you were fetching two different things at the same time. Actually not at the same time. So it would be at the same time without Suspense, where we fetch them like this. But once you do them with Suspense, you're actually chaining them one after the other. And the way around this is to actually just render two components, because if you have two components, even if they are in the same Suspense boundary, then what happens is that React will trigger the fetch for them both and then collect them in the Suspense boundary. Of course, the other thing you can do with use query is we also have use Suspense queries, where you can have the multiple version of it. Don't look at the types, they're pretty complicated. And then you can actually fetch both of them at the same time, and we basically throw a promise.all to React, and then they both start to fetch at the same time again. But going back to enabled, so you want component composition anyway, and with enabled you can also do that, because let's quickly go into the lazy queries things, where we are saying, well, actually I want the other example. I want the example for the dependent queries, because that's what we're usually doing with enable. So we're fetching a user, then we're grabbing the user ID, and then we are fetching the projects by the user. And the problem is that we have to disable the second query for as long as we don't have a user ID. Now, if we do this with Suspense, and let's quickly copy this over, if we do this with Suspense, there's actually two ways to do this. So let's do empty string here, and then I don't know, it doesn't really matter what we do. Fetch post 1, and that gives us the user, and then like this, and then we have user.id or something. Okay, I don't need to go through like all of this, and then we fetch the project by the user, and then we do the enabled then. So if we do the same thing with Suspense, we can actually do two components. So we can do this in the first component, and then we can render a second component where we pass in user ID equals a user.id, and we render this component conditionally. So we do something like user.id question mark, and then otherwise we don't render it. And by conditionally rendering the component, we then have this query or this Suspense query inside the second component, and we're kind of building the dependency without ever touching enabled by component composition. And that works well for some of the cases where you don't actually need the data available in the top level component. So that's one way to do it. But actually, and that's the cool thing about Suspense, and that took me also quite some time to realize, is that because you have these fetch waterfalls, you actually don't care about enabled in that situation. Because if we look at this again, what happens is that query.data is defined. So after I run this query, with use suspense query, I'm actually having the user as a defined thing. So I don't need to disable the second query, because if I have two queries, what happens is that the first query fetches, React suspends, and then the second query fetches. And basically this fetch waterfall that's pretty bad for issues and labels is actually pretty cool, or it's what we want for dependent queries. So if the labels in this case depend on something that the issues return, this automatic waterfall that we are getting is pretty much what we want. Yeah, so that would be my answer to how can we handle enabled with suspense. Is for dependent queries, we don't need to, right? Because it works out of the box without the flag, because the second query is automatically disabled because React suspends while the first one is fetching. And for things where we have like we're waiting for user input, for example, because we have this lazy queries example where we have these filters and we're depending on that. For this, I would actually go with the component composition approach, to just put the query that fetches the table data like into its own component, and I don't need to disable it because I don't have any information all the information that I need to actually fetch call the query function. Yeah, that was my rather long answer about how do you do enabled with suspense. I think I missed maybe a bunch of questions in the chat. Sorry for that. Let me just see what I missed, if there's anything. What are the main benefits of upgrading from version 4 to version 5? That is a good one. And I think I can answer this by just going through the migration guide, because there are like lots of advantages with updating. Obviously you don't have to, so version 4 is going to be maintained for a longer time. There's no immediate need to update. It's also like maybe the only thing is that we probably won't put new features into version 4, but all the new features will go to version 5. That's just the way it is, because we're already so far diverged on the branch that we're having that it's already becomes difficult to actually put features into version 4. I expect new features come into version 5 with minor versions, but like the big step from 4 to 5 actually doesn't have that many features, and I think that's a natural way for major versions to work. I know everybody gets excited about major versions and what new cool stuff do you have in major versions, but if you look at how other libraries are doing stuff, it's actually major versions are for correcting mistakes and are for changing APIs that are necessary. It's not actually about doing features. And I think you can see that because, for example, hooks in React were shipped in version 16.8, right? It wasn't in version 16.0 when doing the major upgrade. It was just in the minor version, here are hooks, boom, go, right? And version 17 had nothing. This was just, we're changing some stupid APIs just to make it easier for whatever situation. And also React Router, they shipped loaders in 6.4, right? It's not like, oh, here we have a new major version and now it has loaders. It's like, we can do these things in minor versions because minor versions are for features. Major versions are for correcting mistakes in APIs. And that's what we're mainly doing. And the first big mistake, the first big thing that we are changing is how you actually call useQuery. And that's a big one, and that has a bunch of implications. And it's not only useQuery, it's actually all the functions. So maybe this needs a little bit of history because it dates back to a time when React Query was written in JavaScript. And there we basically had no TypeScript. And the thing was that it was just convenient to be able to call useQuery in 3 different ways. So you could call useQuery with what you probably all know with the query function. I can actually make this a bit bigger. Sorry if I haven't done this before. Use query with the query key and then the query function and then maybe options like stay time or whatever. 1000. And then there were overloads on that. So it was just convenient, and in JavaScript it's very easy to do. You could just do use query, and then you could do a query key, and then you could put the query function in here and the stay time. or you could leave out the query function at all, because the query function could also be defined as a default query function somewhere globally. So you don't actually need the query function. It's totally optional. This is actually like use query with a query key of to-dos. This is the most basic thing you can do, and it works. But it will only work if you have a query function defined in some of the query defaults that we have. But it actually it's the most minimal legal thing that you could do with the old API. Of course, in the new API where we only have an object available, it's query key to-dos. I think that's why it's red, yeah. And that's then the thing that actually works in version 5. So the third overload then obviously is the one where we just have the option. So you put query key, query fn, and stale time into the same options object. And what happened at runtime was that we would just take these two things, and we would then, the first thing we would do when we call use query is to basically coerce it into this one single options object. And we would just look at, okay, how many parameters did we get into the function? Is it an array? Is it a function? And then we kind of like compose this object out of it. And that has a little bit of runtime overhead, but it was just very convenient for users to be able to call it in multiple different ways. And it was always possible to call it in these three ways. And let's ignore the middle one because that one is just weird, but those two are probably the ones that most people have used. In the docs, we were always using this version. And then with TypeScript, this became obviously a bit more complicated because all of a sudden we needed overloads, and we needed lots of overloads everywhere. And we still needed to do this runtime overhead. And yeah, the other thing is that you could, even though you have query key and query function, you could actually legally put another query key in here. And it doesn't have to be the same, right? Because query key is always part of the options. And then we added omit to kind of these things, and it made the types even more complicated. And then we said, okay, a single options argument is actually the thing that makes most sense for the cases that we're using it. And I get that it is a bit more to write because you need to write query key and query fn every time. But the advantage is that you're actually getting a lot better TypeScript type errors out of it. Because with overloads, what TypeScript is doing is it's always checking all the overloads if something is matching. And then at the end, it's saying, well, this thing doesn't match. The last overload didn't match, and here's the error that you're getting. And the thing is, if we're doing something like, and let's just quickly do a use query with a query key of to-dos and a query fn of let's just do promise.resolve 5 again, and then and then we're going to do something like refetch interval. We just put a typo in here, right? 1. And now, because we only have one object, the error we are getting is directly here, and the error we're getting is refetch interval number. It probably means, did you mean to write refetch interval? And that's a pretty good error, and says, yeah, that's actually what I wanted to do, and here's the error. Now let's take the same thing, and let's do another, TypeScript playground. Let's do another one. And let's not pull in the beta types, but for this I actually need to reload the editor. Yeah, and then the suspense thingies don't exist. Perfect. If I do the same thing in version 4, do them. Yeah, there it was. So the error that we are getting is on the query key for whatever reason. I really don't know. And the error we're getting is no overload matches this call. The last overload gave the following error. Object literal may only specify known properties, and query key does not exist in type read-only unknown array. And isn't that the worst error message you've ever seen? There are probably ways to make this better even with the overloads, but honestly, the new version is just so much easier to do. And there are like tons of other situations. This is just like one of the things that came up. The actual error that was reported by a user, where it took me quite some time to figure it out, was they had a function fetch to-dos or fetch to-do, and it was taking in an ID, and that's a number, and it was returning promise.resolve 5. and then they were passing that function in here, like fetch to do, right? And even without the refetch interval, and that also actually const. If I write it that way, I need a const. Yeah. So this was actually bringing up, I think, the same error, because the function, what it wants to, what you want to do is to actually call it like this. You need to invoke the function, and by passing the function in, it was actually just yielding the same error with no overload matches this call, and the query key cannot be passed or something. And that was really like a weird situation, and it also took me quite some time to see where the actual error is. So the new syntax does make a lot of sense, and it also makes sense for other adapters that are not React. So from what I've seen, but I'd need to, for the actual reasons, I'd need to actually think, no, actually I think I can explain it also as well. It's for solid.js. So when you actually have like a separate query key and a query function and options, you actually need to make everything a function for it to be reactive in solid.js. So you needed to have a query key, and the query key needed to be a function, and then you have the query fn and the query function, always a function, but then all the options as well. And if the only thing that we have is an options to allow, you can just make the whole options object reactive and pass a function in there. So solid.js is also very happy that we're going with the single object notation. And that's probably the biggest change that we have, because it affects really everything. It affects all the functions. It affects, for example, let's do const query client equals new query client. And then on the query client, we do query client dot invalidate queries. And on invalidate queries, you're probably used to pass your like query key in there as well. But the query key is actually only, this was also an overload. The query key is actually just one of the filters that you can pass. And in the old syntax, you could pass in the key as the first one, and then you could pass in additional filters as the second argument, which could have been, for example, you only want to refetch stale queries. I think that you can pass in a boolean. You only want to invalidate the stale ones, or this is also for refetch queries, right? All of them basically work the same way. But the thing is, the query key is also just one of those filters. So what you could do is you could pass in the query key in here as well. And this is again just two different ways of doing the same thing. And we've also just taken the opportunity and reducing this to one thing where you can say, okay, invalidate queries actually only takes query filters. Invalidate query filters as parameters. Filters are an object. A query key is one way to filter your queries down with the fuzzy matching that we have, but it's still, you can pass other, I don't know if there's an auto completion here, no. You can pass other filters here as well. One of them is the predicate function, so you can write a predicate function where you get the query passed in, and then depending on other properties of the query, you can say I want to match my query or I don't want to match my query. So they're all now going together, and the only way to invoke this function is now again with the single object. And for use mutation, it's actually the same thing. Use mutation now takes an object, and then you get the options, and the options, they take a mutation function, and the mutation function is the function that you usually use to pass in the mutation as the first parameter. But because you probably have callbacks anyways on use mutation, right? Because everybody loves the callbacks. I think it now becomes even a bit better to read and write, because now you have use mutation with the function and on success, while before you had use mutation with the function, and then you kind of were opening up an object, and then you had on success on there, something like that. So now you have like this function is kind of like dangling here as the first option of the options. And then all the other options are coming. And I get for use query, you don't often have options because you just use key and function. So there it kind of gets a little bit more to write with query key and query function. But for mutation, I think it's actually a real improvement even when writing stuff, because you can just write it like this right now. And if you're curious on what you can do to prepare for version 5 for this update, there's actually 2 things you can do. For one, we are going to ship a code mod with this. I think it already exists. Yeah, it already exists. So if you want to look at your code base, how it would look with this update, you can just run the code mod, and that removes the overloads and see what kind of things it does. But also, we have an ESLint plugin, and I think not enough people know this, so it's a good opportunity to tell you about this as well. We do have an ESLint plugin that has 2 very important rules, and I need to go back to version 4 because in version 5 it only has 1 rule. And the 1 rule that's very interesting right now is the prefer query object syntax, because this what this rule does is it looks at your code base and it sees, oh, you're using use query with the old syntax, with the use query key, fn, and options, and it basically says, oh, please use the options syntax, and it's auto fixable. So if you enable this rule and you see, like, I don't know, 50 errors in your code base and you auto fix them, it will actually take all your use query calls where you have query key and then query function and then options, and it would just take them and put the query key and the function in the options and pass an object to it. So we just auto fix those errors for you, and you can do this right now in version 4 because the object syntax has always been a valid way to call use query, and it will make updating to version 5 a lot easier for you, I guess. So that's something I can totally recommend, also because of the second rule of the ESLint plugin, which is the exhaustive dependencies rule, which I think I have a bunch of blog posts out there. I have a talk about this topic as well, part of it at least. What you want to do is to include everything that you use in your query function in the query key, because the query key is kind of like a dependency array. So if we have a const id equals 3 and we are having a fetch post function that uses the ID inside the function, if we're closing over the ID, we want to put it in the query key. We don't want to have a query key that's just post and then it uses fetch post with ID, because that would mean that our post with ID 3 would be written in the same cache location as the post with ID 1 and 2 and 4 and 5. So we wouldn't get the caching per input, and we can also run into, like if we write custom hooks and we actually close over props, we would run into state closure issues because of how it works in React. So lots of issues can be avoided, and lots of things actually work great, like automatic refetching when you change something, as long as you put all the dependencies correctly into the query key. And that's what this ESLint rule also does. So yeah, the lint rules are a great way to get started to prepare yourself for version 5. Okay, that's probably the biggest change in terms of syntax that we have. Like, all of these functions now look a bit different and are a bit differently invoked. The same for get query data and get query state. They work a bit differently, and all of these things have code mods. So I would also appreciate it if you're interested, just try out the code mods and let us know if they work, because if they don't, we still have time to fix them. They are obviously a best effort, and they can't do or detect all the possible things that you have, especially if you have a complex code. But if it works for you, let me know, and if it doesn't work, also let me know. That would be cool. Okay, the removed callbacks, we have talked about them quickly, and there's also my blog post about this. This is uninteresting because nobody has, or if you have used remove return from use query, let me know, but nobody I've seen has actually used this because on the query there was a function remove returned, and it was actually remove the query from the cache. But as long as you have access to this, the query is actually mounted, and then you don't want to remove it. I don't know, it's a weird function to return. We've just removed it, and I don't think anybody will miss it. We now need TypeScript version 4.7. I think that's okay. We are on 5.2 already, and this is like a year old, so that's fine. This is actually not that interesting because it's a kind of a pretty edge case. Maybe if we have time, I'll talk about it at the end. One interesting thing is that we have renamed cacheTime to gcTime, and there was actually also a question on Twitter about this, which was, let me quickly find this. Oh, I haven't written it down. Anyway, I think I saw a question where someone said, "Well, why do you rename it to gcTime?" So the thing is that cacheTime is a very unintuitive way to tell you what it's actually doing. Because if you read cacheTime, or if I read cacheTime, like I think it was one of my first discussions I opened 3 years ago on the project, is that I thought that cacheTime and stale time was confusing, and I didn't understand what it was doing. Because if I read cacheTime, I thought, okay, this is the time for how long my data will be cached, right? It defaults to 5 minutes. Okay, cacheTime is 5 minutes. But that's not what it's doing. It's like, because it sounds to me like if I have a query, after 5 minutes, it won't be cached anymore, or it will only be cached for that amount of time. But that's not true, because queries that are actively used, so if you render a query with useQuery on the screen, it will be in your cache forever, for as long as this component is used. If the user leaves the page open for 24 hours, we will not remove it from the cache, because something that is actively used can't be removed from the cache, because the next time the component renders, it would fall back into a hard loading state or whatever. We can't just remove data that is actually used on the screen in the components that you're rendering. So this is not what cacheTime is doing. What cacheTime is doing is, if your query becomes unused because you switch away to a different screen, like you go from the to-do list to the profile page, you no longer display the to-do list, you don't need the to-do data, then we still keep it in the cache for 10 minutes or for 5 minutes, for whatever the cache time says. And that's the confusing part, because it's not the time as long as we cache things, it's the time until things get garbage collected. And yes, Moshifan, gcTime stands for garbage collection time. I think GC is a very common term in it's a well-known abbreviation in computer science. I think Java has garbage collection, obviously. I think Git has Git GC, which does garbage collection. So it just means that we start a timer when your thing becomes unused, and then after that time we are free to garbage collect it, because it's no longer in use. And I think that reflects the time, the thing what it does a bit better, and I hope it will kind of stop a couple of discussions before they start, or like answer a bunch of questions that I had to answer over and over again implicitly with the better naming. There's also code mod for this, so there's just a tiny change. I also don't think that anybody, or like most people, don't even touch that setting. Or like if you read cacheTime, you think that you have to touch it, because I want to customize how long I cache my stuff. But this is actually a setting that I've never really touched it. Like it doesn't really matter how long things are in memory. Maybe you have some very heavy things that need like hundreds of megabytes of memory that you want to garbage collect as soon as possible, and you can set it to 0. But usually when you're working with a normal app, you just leave the default on 5 minutes. You don't need to work, and we don't need to worry about garbage collection. It's just an automatic feature, just like you don't worry about garbage collection in Java that much. It just works, and you don't care about it. And I think here I wanted to kind of communicate the same thing. Delete from storage after this amount of time if not currently being used. Yes, perfect. We can do long names as long as we want. I'm not a big fan of this. I think RTK query does something like that. They have keep unused data for as the name of their variable. So it's like keep unused data for, and then 10 minutes, right? If it works, it works. I don't know. I think it's, for me, it's kind of like you can go quite abroad, like overboard with long names as well. I'm not a big fan of abbreviations either, and this is kind of like an exception to the rule, I guess. There was another suggestion, and it was a debate between gcTime and inactive cacheTime. And I also liked inactive cacheTime at first, because inactive cacheTime First of all, the word inactive is in there, which is good because inactive is also one of the query filters that we have, right? So you can do type, and then type can be active or inactive, or all, I think, or none. And none is not a type, so all or inactive. And the inactive queries are the ones that are not actively used, so the ones that can be potentially garbage collected. So inactive cacheTime also kind of like talks about this same naming, and it still has cacheTime in there. So it's kind of like if you come from a previous version, you know what cacheTime is. Now it's inactive cacheTime. That's not such a big change. But there's also another reason why we didn't go for this, and one of them is this. Okay, you could mistake this for like what's an inactive cache, and then there's a time for it, instead of it's an inactive and then cacheTime. So that was kind of like you don't really know where the wording ends here. And the second reason was that the way we have worded stale time, which is the other timer that we have, is that stale time is the time until a query goes stale, right? And the what inactive cacheTime would communicate is kind of like the opposite. So it's not the time until like something happens, but it's the time for how long something will be cached. And stale time doesn't tell you how long your query is fresh in the cache, right? If we wanted that, we would have named it something like fresh time, or like kind of the opposite, like the time how long your query is fresh. This is kind of like it tells the same thing, but it's kind of viewed from a different perspective. And the same with gcTime and inactive cache. It's like the time until your query can be will be garbage collected, and the time how long inactive queries will be cached. And this is kind of like the same thing, but viewed from a different angle. But anyways, this is a bit of a bike shedding discussion that has happened here, I think. And we've settled on gcTime, and I think it's fine. And most people probably don't want to listen, don't want to like customize this anyway. Okay. Let me just drink a sip of water while I read the last messages. Okay. From Projam, I would like to set a priority on cached queries for local storage persistence. I don't want the table listing data to push out my app settings data. What do you mean with push out? So the way local storage persistence works is that all the queries are basically persisted to the cache, and nothing will push out anything until you actually opt into one of our retry strategies on the local storage persistence. So I don't really fully understand the question, because as long as there's enough space in local storage, we'll just store everything and nothing will be removed. Yeah. But maybe this question is something you can also ask me on the Discord if you have an example for it, that I can look at, because that's probably a bit easier to answer. Yeah, what happens when the space fills by default? Nothing, it errors. It doesn't save anymore. So unless you opt in, I think this is a feature we added in version 4. So if we look at the persist query client, this is something that would have been interesting on a version 4 stream. What we have added is where's the option about retries? It's not here. Okay. Let me just quickly find it, and probably it's in the sync services, because that's where we have the things. Yeah. So if you use the persister, you can provide retries. So the persistence can fail if the size exceeds the available space on the storage. So what you can do is you can provide a retry function, and the retry function has this interface where you get the client in and you get the error in and how often it has errored, and you can say, well, from this client I want to only store the newest one, or I want to manipulate the client, delete some of the things that are in there that I don't necessarily need to persist. And then you return a new persisted client, and then the persister will retry the persistence with that client. Per default, none of those are turned on, so it just errors, and you will get an error somewhere, I think. But we have a retry strategy that's called remove oldest query. So what it does is that if you opt into this retry strategy, what happens is that when the local storage is full, we look at the retry strategy, we run it. This one will just, if you have 20 queries in there, we take the oldest one, the one that was fetched like most in the past, and then it will retry with 19 queries, right? And if that's still too large, then it removes the oldest one again, and then still tries to do that with 18 and so on. But we can also, I'm also open to add more strategies. There were some people that would just like cut the cache in half and then try it again, then cut it in half again, just to not write that often. There are different ways on how to handle this, or you can just write your own strategy here. It's really just a function that implements this interface, and then you're good to go. Okay, let's go back to the migration guide and look at some other things that we have. So that was the cacheTime and the gcTime. Okay, useErrorBoundary has been renamed to throw on error. Yeah, I hope this change is kind of a bit obvious. I never liked the name useErrorBoundary. I think it was there from, I don't know if it was there from before hooks, but you know, an option that's called useErrorBoundary sounds like a hook to me. Also, it's error boundary is kind of a term that's connected to React, and it's not really what's happening. I think other frameworks also have error boundaries, but it's not really what's happening under the hood. What happens is that React query catches the error and then throws it in the next in the next render cycle. And we already have throw on error in a bunch of other places as options, for example, for refetch. So yeah, an easy rename as far as I'm concerned to throw on error. It also has a code mod, and you probably set this globally or not at all. So it doesn't really matter much. Yeah, TypeScript error is now the default type for errors instead of unknown. This is an interesting one, and something there where I wasn't really sure if we should really do this, but it's probably the best way to go forward. One problem with React query is, or one problem with promises in general, is that you can only type the success type of the promise, because a promise only has one type. You can't really type what kind of error you're getting. And you have the same problem with try catch in TypeScript. If you're actually just writing a try and then throw new error foo, and then you do catch and you do e, then your error will be of type unknown. That is what TypeScript does, unless you turn off the setting that's called use unknown in catch clauses or something. tsconfig, something with unknown. Yeah, use unknown in catch variables. That I think that's on per default, but you can opt out of it, and then it will be any. So you kind of like you have the option for your error to be either unknown or any. And any is totally unsafe, and unknown is totally safe, but totally annoying. Because with unknown, you can't do anything. And you always have to, if e instance of error, and then you can do console log e.message. And that's yay, that's okay, but you know, we are throwing an error here. So why isn't the error like the type error per default? By the way, you can't do that. It must be any or unknown. Okay, so why isn't it error? Because we are throwing errors, right? If you have a runtime error, you get a type error from TypeScript, or you get a reference error, or you get from fetch you get a network error, for example. So why isn't it error? Well, because in JavaScript you can throw anything. You can throw hello world. You can throw promises. That is what React is doing. Throw new promise. That is how Suspense works. Right? Promise.result, or like, yeah, you know what I mean. You can throw promises, you can throw functions, you can throw objects, you can throw whatever you want. So at the moment where you catch an error, you don't really know what it is. So the correct thing to do is to do unknown, and that's what we had in version 4 and the versions before that. And I think it's the correct thing to do, but it's not very ergonomic, right? I don't think anybody really throws something other than errors in their code. Like 99.9% of use cases is to work with errors. And I think it's a pragmatic choice to say, okay, we don't know what kind of errors we're getting, but we're assuming it's of type error. Because I don't think I hope no sane developer would actually throw hello world or a string or a number or whatever. But they would obviously create a new error and throw that one. Or they're going to use like a wrapper around fetch, or they're going to use Axios, there you get an Axios error and things like that. So I think with KY, they have their own implementation. Yes, you get an HTTP error on that. So these are all subclasses of error. And there are also ESLint rules that tell you don't throw anything that isn't an error. It's just bad practice. And with that in mind, we said, okay, in version 5, the error that's going to be returned from use query is no longer unknown. It's going to be of type error. Yeah, so error or null in this case, because we haven't checked for is error yet. But if you have an error, it's going to be of type error, which is the pragmatic choice, even though it's not the absolutely correct thing. Because if I throw something that's not an error here, I will access .message and it might fail. So if you're doing that, what can you do? So the only other way to type errors was to provide the generics to use query. And if you know me, you know I'm no fan of these angle brackets here. But what I could do is you can do number, and then you can do error here. And then it will, or you could actually do number. If we throw a number, right, then error will also be of type number. Because the second generic to use query is the one that tells you that what the type of the error is. But there are many bad things about this. The first bad thing is that it ruins type inference. So use query actually has 4 generics, and the other ones will then, if you provide 2 of those, it will fall back to the default variables that are assigned there. So you're ruining the select function, you're ruining a bunch of other functions that don't work anymore. And the other thing is you lose the type inference from the query function. So if your query function starts to return a string, then you actually have to change this over here to string. And if you have complex types and you actually want to leverage type inference, if you have like a generated API client from GraphQL that actually gives you the types back, why would I have to write out the types right here? So those are the 2 things that made it actually impossible, or like quite hard to type the errors. But if you're using Axios, for example, maybe you want to put Axios error here, right? So if I'm using Axios, how can I make my error be of type Axios error? First of all, it's probably still not the best idea because there could be other errors. If you're using a select function and the select function has a runtime error, you will get something that's not an Axios error. So we can't really say for sure that even if we're using axios.get, we can't really say for sure that what we are getting back is an Axios error, even though if that's what the query function is using. But this is also a trade-off that you can actually like just accept. You can say, okay, I know for my use case that really like almost 100% of the time I'm getting an Axios error back here, but error per default is still going to be just error and not Axios error. So how can I do this? And in version 5, there is a way to define global errors. And it's in, I think it won't work in the code sandbox, but it works in like a real project. So yeah, foot guns. Yeah, am I adding more foot guns here? I don't know. I think it's something that you can use, but you don't have to. So you can actually use module augmentation to achieve this, but this is module augmentation that is not something that you are doing because you're unhappy with the type that we are providing. This is the module augmentation that we have actually meant to be used like that. So we are exposing an interface register, and this interface is basically empty. It has a it does allow you to pass a default error into it, where you're telling me or where we are telling the library what's going to be the type of the errors that I want to get per default. And If you don't do this, then you get back the normal error as we've seen. But if you actually amend the TanStack React query register interface and you say my error is going to be Axios error, then your error will be of type Axios error. Let me just quickly try this out if this also works in here. Well, let's do number, because for the fun of it. And then let's delete all of this. So what is error going to be? A number. Yeah, so it also works here. Okay, so if you amend the default error interface and you provide your type here, then you get back like a more narrow type. But you don't have to do this in this direction. You can also do it in the other direction. So if you're unhappy with the change that we are defaulting it to error, and you say no, I want like the try catch behavior where I'm getting unknown, the only thing you have to do is put unknown here. And then you kind of like have these 4 lines of code, and then you're basically back to the version 4 behavior of your errors are unknown everywhere in your application. And the only, like, one of the drawbacks of this thing is that if you have a monorepo where you're using TanStack query in like 3 different sub projects or packages, and each one of them would want to have their own module augmentation, then this kind of doesn't work, because module augmentation, as far as I'm aware, only works globally for once. So that's kind of the drawback. If you do this once, it's going to be done for everything. But yeah, this is kind of the way how you can define the types for errors without having to pass generics here, which I think would be the worst way to do it. Feel like this change will be controversial and it might come back when people adopt version 5. Do you mean the change of defaulting to error, or do you mean the change of allowing module augmentation? Because those are two different things. I would probably agree with the module augmentation. I don't think the error is going to be that dramatic. And at least there is a way to go back. I think have I even written this in the I haven't written this here. I should probably write this here, like how can you go back to the previous version, and that's with this way of going back to unknown. I think, yeah, we'll see. I'm not convinced that this is too controversial. Like if you really, I don't know what situation would you have where you throw something that's not an error and then you're surprised that the error is typed as an error. But maybe I'm wrong on this, yeah. If you have an example where this would be weird, please share it with me. Okay. Typing query options is something that's somewhat interesting, but not that interesting. Is that everything? This can't be everything. Oh, let me just see. Oh, we're on that. I'm not on the migration guide anymore. Okay. Right. Okay, we can quickly talk about keep previous data and placeholder data, which is 2 features that have existed on useQuery that we have combined into a single one. And this was also, yeah, Kevin asked a question on this, and there was also a different question of, can you show an example of how we derive or get keep previous data and is previous data in version 5? So quickly to get you all on the same page, what keep previous data is doing is that, and let me just start a new something here. So what we can do is we can do use query, and we can have a query key, and we're going to do let's do let filters something, and then we do to-dos and filters, and then we do query fn, and this is going to be fetch to-dos with filters. And I'm just going to declare a function fetch to-dos here, which takes filters something, and it returns a promise of array of, I don't know, something. So basically a to-do. If we have an app where we do this, and we kind of have filters on this, then what happens is every time that filters change, so the user selects a filter and clicks the apply button, what happens is that we switch from one filter to the other, which means we're switching from one query key to the next. And switching between query keys is a big operation in React Query, because it means the observer that we are creating goes from observing one query to a completely different query. And technically, those two have nothing to do with each other. So if you have something in your query cache that's to-dos, and then the filter is done true, right? And then you have another one where the filter is done false, or maybe it's author me or whatever. You have different kinds of filters. Those are different entries in the query cache. And even though if you have like a custom hook that's use to-dos and it gets filters passed in, then still, even though you use them from like the same custom hook, from the cache perspective, they have nothing to do with each other. They're two completely different cache entries. They do share some parts of the key, which means you can target them with fuzzy query invalidation, but they have nothing to do with each other in terms of how the cache is concerned. So that means when you click on this apply button for your filter, what happens is that you see a new query with a filter that you haven't seen before, and your query goes into the loading state. And then you see like a big loading spinner or whatever. And especially for pagination, where you have like the page number in the query key, or also for filtering sometimes, this might be not what you want. So what you can do is you in version 4, you could pass a flag that's called keep previous data true. And it was a Boolean flag where you could say, I want to keep the previous data. So I want to keep data from the previous query key rendered on the screen while I'm transitioning from one query key to the next. It's a very narrow flag, and people often assume that keep previous data means something different, like it can keep data between fetches of the same query key or something. It doesn't. It only works when you actually change from one query key to the next. And what you then get back is your data that will be while you're fetching a query that has no data. So if I'm going from done true to author me, and I don't have data for this query, we are still going to display data from the old query key. So it's actually fake data, right? It has nothing to do. If I switch from to-dos filters and I switch from to-dos to profile data, right? And I have keep previous data on, I would still get the to-do list returned, even though my query is not profile data. Obviously, this doesn't happen in a real-life situation, because you don't have the same component with the same hook order, and that actually like calls the use query hook with completely different data. So it's largely irrelevant. But just conceptually, you're getting back data from a query that's not yourself. And this is why I think this is actually kind of like fake data. So what you get back is you get it back in the data field, and your query is in success state, but you get back a flag called is previous data. And is previous data is set to true, and you can use that to actually like render your data a bit differently. Maybe you want to gray it out because it doesn't actually belong to your query. You want to render it a bit differently, but it's still probably a better experience to keep this previous data on the screen as compared to rendering like a hard loading state. And that's what this flag is for, exclusively. And then there is a second feature that's called placeholder data. And placeholder data is pretty similar to keep previous data. Let's just try to get the correct syntax here. Yeah. And placeholder data still exists in, keep previous data was removed, and placeholder data exists in version 5. So, and it also existed in version 4. And what placeholder data is, it's something similar. It is meant to be fake data that you want to display while you're having a hard loading state. So in placeholder data, I could say I want an empty array, or I want an array where I have like 2 to-dos in there that are kind of like what I want to display as a placeholder instead of a loading spinner while I'm making the fetch. And for this data, what you would get is back is a separate flag, which is called is placeholder data. And again, this is pretty similar to is previous data, because it's meant to say, well, if is placeholder data is true, I now have a separate way to render it. Maybe I want to gray it out. Maybe I want to render it a bit differently, because it's just placeholder data. It's not the real data that I'm getting back from my actual fetching function, because the fetching function hasn't run yet. And maybe you can already see where this is going. In version 4, if you had keep previous data turned on and placeholder data defined, you would actually get back is placeholder data and is previous data on both of them. And those two flags are actually mutually exclusive. And if you're thinking about, I don't know, maybe David Grushnit will back me up on this one. If you're looking at this from a state machine perspective, you cannot be placeholder data and previous data at the same time, right? Either you are what we're passing in here, or you are what we are, getting back from our previous observer that we've observed. So you have 2 flags, and 2 flags means 4 states, but actually it's just 3 states. It's just the real, actually just 2 states. It's the real data or it's the fake data. And if you have placeholder data and previous data on at the same time, I actually don't know in version 4 what happened. I think one of them obviously takes precedence, but it's an implementation detail which one actually was used. I don't think it makes any sense to have these 2 things, because your data can only be one thing. You can't have 2 different datas at the same time. And that is why we've combined the 2 actually. So placeholder data, even in version 4, it could be a function, and that function could return something. And we did that because functions can be memoized and stuff like that. Maybe you don't want to run this on every render. If you have a function that creates a big 5,000 array with lots of objects that takes long to generate, you can pass in a function, and we invoke this function, and then you get that placeholder that is returned from that. But the change that we did is that instead of having a flag keep previous data, is we are passing the previous data as an argument to the placeholder data function. So you can now say you have complete control over how the placeholder how you want the placeholder to look at, because it gets past the previous data, which is then probably like the structure that we have, or undefined, because on the first transition you get undefined in there, and then you actually want to display the real placeholder data that we had in version 4. But once we are past that point, when we're transitioning from one query to the other, you actually want to maybe look at the previous data and say, oh, I have previous data. That means I'm transitioning from the query key to the next. I want to display that previous data, or I want to display parts of that previous data. You can actually do whatever you want in that function with that information. We're also passing the previous query in there. So you actually get access to the whole query, including like all the meta object and key and whatever, to just do comparisons that you want to see, okay, what kind of placeholder data do I want to return from my query while it's in the fetching state. And obviously the is previous data flag doesn't exist anymore, but you have this is placeholder data. That's, then tells you, yes, you are placeholder or no. And of course, the equivalent of keep previous data is the identity function that basically does this. So it's previous data, return previous data. If we don't have previous data, we return undefined, which means no placeholder, which means a hard loading state. And if we have previous data, we return it. Does previous query include previous data? Yes, it does, because previous query has previous query dot data, I guess, dot states dot data or something. So it's in there, yeah. Unless, of course, you use select, then previous data and previous created state of data can be different, because the previous data is the data from the observer, and in the query you have the data of the query. So if you do data transformation with select, it might be a bit different. Yeah, having it in the param makes it almost as simple. Yeah, so you have access to everything in here, and just for completeness, and this is I think what our code mod is doing. We are exporting a function called keepPreviousSdata, and you can pass this function to placeholder data if you're used to calling your things keepPreviousData, or you just want to go an easy upgrade path. And the function keepPreviousData, it's really an identity function. So it's defined as a function just returns the first argument. So it's basically just this, right? So this is the function that we are actually exporting from here. So there's no magic in there. It just takes the, let me just kind of, nope, I can't click into it, but it's a function that takes the previous data and returns basically the same thing. So this is also something that you can do if you were using keepPreviousData true. This is the actual replacement for it. It's placeholder data. My placeholder is please keep the previous data. If you want more fine-grained control, you can also do, you can also do this. That's the same thing, right? Or you can do some logic in here and return data or return nothing. Yeah, that is the new way to do keepPreviousData. Kevin, does that answer your question? Let me can you learn more about keepPreviousData? Yeah, that was the one. That was the one thing. And the other question that you had, I think, was about infinite queries. And infinite queries is a topic that I want to talk about anyways, because infinite queries have a lot of changes, hopefully for the better. And I think after another sip of water, I'll go talk about infinite queries. Okay. Let me just pull up the question. Really curious to learn more about keepPreviousData. Yes, we have covered this, and the new infinite query sliding window features. And what are the best practices for prefetching paginated data? Okay, so let's talk about the infinite query features that we have and the changes that we're doing to infinite queries. Let me just see if they are, there are also some spicy changes in there. Okay, infinite queries. Let's do this one first. Let's import useInfiniteQuery and useInfiniteQuery, and obviously it also needs an object now, and we pass in the query key to do, and we pass in a query function that resolves with an empty array. So I think in version 4 this was all you needed, but in version 5 you will actually get an error with this, I guess, because there are some things missing, which is get next page param and default page param. And so infinite queries work in a way that you basically have one cache entry and it's chunked up into multiple pages, so that you can produce this infinite feed where you fetch more data, or you have this automatic with a button, or you have this scroll to bottom and then fetch some more. And for this to work, you need to provide a get next page param function, which is a function that returns a value that indicates what the next page will what the next page should use as its basically its offset or its cursor for fetching. So if we think about a simple paginated query, let's do it like that, where we are basically not having anything in there apart from like the data that we want. So let's do numbers. I think let's do numbers 5 and then 23 and 42. So let's assume we have like an array of these things, and if you know infinite queries, they basically have a shape that looks a bit like this. So it has a shape of object, and in this shape of objects it has basically pages in there, and the second one is page params, which is the params that was used to fetch the pages. So if we have, or let's just do 1, 2, 3, it's probably easier. So if we have 3 pages in there, we fetch the page 1 initially. Initially we start out with 2 empty things, right? And then the question is, okay, we need to fetch the first page. We fetch the first page and we get back the number 1. And then the question is, okay, how do we fetch the next page, right? And in order to fetch the next page, we need information from the previous page to compute what will be the next page to fetch. This could be, if this is something like it has some data, and then maybe it has a cursor that tells you like what is the next page to fetch, which usually cursor-based pagination does, then you can just look at that cursor and return that. If you don't have that, then, and you say, oh, I just want basically like the first page gets the parameter 0, the next gets 1, the next gets 2, then you can also just look at the length of the array that you basically got back here and just, you know, say, okay, the next page is just like the length plus 1, and then we get like 2, and then we fetch the next one. We have 3 pages in there, we fetch the next one, and so on. So that also works really well. So let's do that for a second without any pagination. That means the get next page param, it gets in like the previous, it gets in the last page, and it gets in the all pages, and we can just say all pages.length plus 1. This will just create a cursor that basically increments by 1 every page that we fetch. And the one thing that also goes in there when I said, okay, if you don't have anything, we have to fetch the first page. And the question is always, what is the page parameter for the first page? And in version 4, the thing that we did is the first page always had the page param undefined. So we said, okay, this is the first page. We don't know how to fetch it, so it's going to be undefined. And this means that since the page param is passed to the query function so that you can then fetch the next page with it, let's do page param plus 23. It was basically passed into here, and it was undefined. And that's what all the docs showed, is that you can just assign a default value here. And then because you have a default value, it coerces undefined back to like 0 in this case. And there is a bit of a drawback to this approach. One is the typings. So we don't know what page param is, and in version 4 the page param was actually of type any, because we couldn't infer the type from the usage, because the usage was defined from whatever you basically assign as the default value here, plus what was returned from here. So it was kind of a bit weird to do on typings level. And the second problem was actually with serialization. So if we have, for example, then we fetch the next page, and this has then 1, and then we have the next page 3, and this has the page param 2. We're actually storing it in this exact structure in our cache. And if we were to serialize this, it would actually turn undefined to null. And that's a if you do JSON stringify and JSON parse. So if you have this on the server and you're sending an infinite query from the server to the client, or if you're storing it in local storage and then rehydrating it from there, your undefined page param was turned into null. And that was actually a long-standing issue with that thing. And the problem about this is, of course, if you have null in there, this default value assignment doesn't work anymore, because now page param won't be assigned like the value 0, because the default parameter assignment only works with undefined. So now we would calculate null plus 23, and this would be whatever JavaScript yields then. I don't know. So that was one of the problems with the way we've handled the default parameters for the fetching. And in version 5, we've eliminated both of these problems with the same approach. We are now requiring a default page param to be passed here. And the default page param it can be whatever you want, right? Could also be a string. But the thing is that whatever you put into the default page param must also be the same type that get next page param returns. So if I do a string here as default page param, then I hope it's going to give me, yeah, string is not assignable to number. So it's going to say, okay, then both of these need to be strings, right? So now we have string of this and string of this. And then the page param we're getting here is also inferred to as the type string. So there's a lot more type safety with this approach. And if we put this back to number and then we give the string away here, then this will also go back to being a number. So all of the type inference here works as you'd expect it to. And in version 4, page param was just any, and it was just like a hole in the typings. I wasn't really happy with that. And the second thing is that now, because we have a default page param, we no longer have to store undefined on the first value. So now if the default page param is 0, we have a 0 in there, and we have no more problem with serializing these things. Because everything is just a param, and yeah. I'd call default from an initial page param. Yeah, that's also a good one. Maybe we should do that. I think I opted for default page param because it was used as a default value here, which now doesn't make any sense anymore because it's always going to be a number. So we have like the default page param. It's the one that's used per default, but I actually like initial page param as well. Maybe we should change that. Initial page param, same as initial data. Yeah, get it. I like the suggestion. Maybe open a discussion on GitHub, then we can discuss this a bit more. It's naming discussions are always fun until they go into backshading, but I think this is I'm not super married to the name default page param, but I think, yeah, default might imply that it's used in multiple places as a default, but initial is actually like the page param you want for the first one. So I agree that initial might be a bit better named for what it does exactly. So yeah, those are the breaking changes around the infinite query. And what Kevin was mentioning earlier already is there's a new feature on infinite queries that's I think I called them a sliding window, which is a feature that's replacing another feature that we had that was removed in version 5 that I think was actually like not a good feature. And I added this feature somewhere in, I think, version 3 or version 4, I don't remember, where I wasn't really happy about it, but I kind of gave into like the pressure from people that wanted this feature. And that feature is about refetching infinite queries. And apparently refetching infinite queries is a big topic for lots of people because, and let's look at this structure here again, and let's make it a bit more like real life. So let's assume that we have in our pages, we have objects, right? And all of these objects might have like 25 things in there. So the first one is 0, then we have 25, then we have 50, and then we have 150 and so on, right? So everything in here is like big pages, like 25 tweets or whatever per thing. And then the thing is, what happens if we have like a lot of them? So like really like maybe 10 or 20 pages or whatever, because people scroll down a lot. Then not only do we have like maybe, I don't know, 1,000 objects, tweets, whatever, in our cache memory. What also happens is that if you do an invalidation of that thing, all of those pages get fetched in succession. So we fetch the first one, the next one, the next one, the next one. We fetch all of those 25 or whatever, how many pages you have, until the end is reached, or until one of them returns undefined from get next page param, because there is no more page anymore. And people often question, like, why are you doing this? Why are you refetching all the pages? And I think I've brought up a million examples already that this is mainly about consistency of your infinite queries. And the thing why this breaks very easily when it's inconsistent with an inconsistency problem is when you have inserts or deletes. And it's like it's relatively easy to explain if we just ignore the page params for a second, and let's assume that we have like arrays of arrays, and there we have 1, 2, 3 in the first page, and then we have like 4, 5, 6 on the second page, and then we have like 7, 8, 9 on the last page, right? I don't know why I'm copying this like this, but whatever. So 7, 8, 9 on the last page, and let's ignore the page params because they're actually irrelevant for this example. And what people often wanted to do is, yeah, when I refetch this thing, I only want to refetch like the first page of it. But what happens if you refetch the first page and not the second page if element 2 has been deleted in the meantime? And you refetch that, and then actually what you're getting is 1, 3, 4, because 2 has been deleted. And then if you don't refetch the second page as well, because the second page would actually be 5, 6, 7, but since you don't refetch it, your feed will show 1, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, which means you show like duplicated data of, you know, in your feed or whatever your infinite query is doing, because you haven't refetched them all. And in this case, if that happens, we refetch all of them in succession, because then actually this goes to 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, and then this goes to 8 and 9, or maybe it goes to 8 and 9 and 10. But if there is no 10, then it just goes to 8 and 9. Because the one thing was deleted, everything shifts. And the same is with inserting, right? If you insert a new element, everything in your feed of data must shift from one page to the next in the situations where you have more than one page. So yeah, this is the reason why we refetch all the pages, because there is only one cache entry and we want all the pages to be consistent. And I get that if you have like 25 pages and there's a lot of refetch happening, right? It's like it's going to make 25 requests in succession to the backend, and you might think, okay, I don't need that. There are many ways around that. Obviously, the easiest is to set a higher stale time, because if you set a higher stale time of, I don't know, 10 minutes, then in those 10 minutes there won't be any refetches, and you don't have that problem. If there's one refetch happening every 10 minutes, and yes, if your user scrolled down 25 times, then after 10 minutes, and if there is a trigger, you will get 25 fetches. I don't think that's a big problem, but obviously people think it's a problem. So the API that we had that was actually bad was that on query client dot, I don't know, fetch query or refetch queries or invalid queries, actually everywhere on all those functions, even on refetch returned from use query, we allowed passing in a refetch page function. And that refetch page function basically got the page and the index, I think, and you could do something like index triple equals 0. And what that did was, it was basically, or let's do refetch queries. What this did was, please, and then let's do query key to-dos, right? So what this did was, please refetch my infinite query, but only refetch the first page of it, or maybe only refetch the last page or whatever. So you could fine-grained decide which page to refetch. And again, I think this is a bad feature, because what it does is it creates inconsistencies. And second of all, we didn't really think this through, because refetch page was only available on imperative APIs. So on refetch queries, invalidate queries, reset queries, all the other functions that we have. It wasn't available on automatic fetches. So if you had like a refetch on window focus that was triggered, it would always fetch all the pages, because we would actually need to have this function like somewhere here. And then what people would want to see is, well, if it's a window focus, I only want to refetch the first page, but if it's a manual one, I want to refetch them all. And this was kind of getting out of hand, and the API was like not good, and the feature wasn't good. And also refetch page existed on refetch queries, but it would only have an effect if you would target an infinite query. But you could also pass this thing to normal query invalidation that didn't even target infinite queries. So this was kind of like a bad thing and a bad end. And I regretted adding that API, and I'm glad that we're removing it in version 5. But we also have a replacement that will hopefully fix the issue of, I have 25 pages in my cache and need to refetch all of them. How can I handle this? And the approach that we're having is that you will be able to pass a max pages property to your query, to your infinite query. And this max pages will allow you to define how many pages should be stored in the cache at most at any point in time. So if I go back to my example and I set this to 2, let's restore this example with 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6, and then 7, 8, 9. So what happens in this example is that if I have 1, 2, 3, and I fetch the next page, I get 4, 5, 6, and then I fetch the next page 7, 8, 9. But at this time, if I have the max pages 2, it means I only want 2 pages in the cache. So what we do is we're going to delete 1, 2, 3. And then if I fetch the next page, it's going to be 10, 11, 12. 4, 5, 6 is going to rotate out of the cache. So we're only going to have the last 2 pages in the cache, which means that if you refetch them, we will only refetch those 2 pages and not the other ones that are before. And that makes sense because at that time your user, if each page has 50 entries, you have 100 entries with 2 pages anyways, and your user has scrolled down like far enough that the other ones that were before that are so far away that they've basically rotated out of the cache, depending on how big your page size is and also how big your max pages size is. Obviously, max pages defaults to infinity, so we'll always, like per default, keep all the pages in the cache, but you can opt out of this by passing a max pages number in here. Now, then the next question is like, what happens if the user is on like this, and then they go here and then they scroll up, right? Because they want to go back to the first page. It's like, oh, what happens now? How do I get my 4, 5, 6 cache entry back? And the answer is you have to actively fetch it, right? And the good news is that React Query offers bidirectional infinite queries. So the only thing you need to do is basically implement the getPreviousPage param function that gets past the first page and all pages. And you can then determine, okay, now I'm going this direction. I need to get like the previous cursor of this. And if you go to the top and then there's like a fetch more happening in the previous direction, then you would actually get your 4, 5, 6 back. And at this point in time, with the max pages of 2, the 10, 11, 12 would rotate out. So you kind of really have this window that goes left and right over your amount of pages that you want to see, that you want to have in the cache. And you can decide how big this window is going to be, how many pages you want to store in the cache, and you need to obviously implement getNext and getPreviousPage param. But yeah, we are actually not only passing last page and all pages, we are also passing a last page param and all page params in there. So we're passing like this array and this array. So you always know with which parameter was the last page or the first page fetched, and then you can basically like -1 this if you want to. So there are definitely ways to implement bidirectional infinite queries even if you don't have a cursor, even if you just have a normal paginated query that you put into an infinite query. Yeah, how will this work with TanStack Virtual? Well, I don't see it any different than like normal bidirectional queries, because the only thing that happens is that some data is thrown away from the cache and it just doesn't render anymore. I don't think it has, unless I'm missing something, I don't think it has any real implications on virtualization. It just, if you're using virtualization, maybe it is because you have like very big page sizes. If you have like multiple pages that are small and you have like lots of them and you want to virtualize them, maybe it's better to just use the max pages feature and limit the number of pages, because if you scroll down rapidly, you don't need the top things anyways anymore. But I think it goes very well together, just like in version 4, and it's also a feature that is optional, so you can opt into this if you want. Okay, I think this is all the features we had. Yeah, removed refetch page in favor of max pages. That's one of the things we had. New infinite queries need a default page param. We had that. Manual mode for infinite queries is something that nobody has used. I don't think anybody knows about this. We now need React 18 because we dropped support for version 17. And I think that's just about it, but apart from a bunch of renames. And then there's this big one. Yeah, this is something that I'm going to discuss next. Right. So if you're, let me just drink a bit of water again, and then I'm going to explain this change, which is a bit of cosmetics, but yeah. I guess. Is the new infinite queries not out yet? It's available in beta. So so infinite queries is out. If you use the beta version of TanStack version 5, you should be able to use the new way of doing infinite queries. It's there. I think it should be there. Okay. Let's talk about the loading status change real quickly. So if you remember version 4, we had this controversial change that we previously used to have 4 different status things. So we used to have loading, we used to have success, and we used to have error. That's basically the 3 things that we have that your query can be in. And except that there was a 4th one, and that was idle. And there was this update in version 4 that the idle state has been removed. And the thing why we removed the idle state is because it was a very weird state from a combination of states perspective and also from a type narrowing perspective that your query could be in. So to iterate, if we have a normal use query, and let me just copy one from above because like let's do const my query, and then this is just like a normal use query. Then the query can be in 3 different states. So we have my my query.status, and it can be in error or success, or in version 4 it was loading, or it was idle in version 3. And the problem with idle was that what people expected it to be is if you're using this and if you're checking for if my query.status triple equals error, then you basically handle the error here, and then you do if my query.status triple equals, and I'm putting in loading here just for the sake of it, and then you're going to handle like the spinner, and afterwards you'd expect like my query.data like map or whatever it is. You expected my query.data to be defined, because you have checked the error state, you have checked the loading state. What else is there, right? It's like a promise has 3 states. It has like a pending, rejected, or resolved, right? So a promise has 3 states. Why is there a 4th one? Well, the 4th one was there because you could have enabled false, or you could have enabled not some condition, right? And with enabled, your query doesn't run. So your query wasn't in loading state, your query wasn't in success state, your query wasn't in error state, it was in an idle state. But because on type level it's very hard to know if your query is actually enabled or not, and this idle state was always part of the union. And you know, there was also this secondary state. This is the fetch status that can be in fetching, or it can be in paused, which was a feature that we introduced in version 4 for all the network status changes that we made. And there we had an idle state, right? Because it means, okay, I'm not really fetching anything. And the solution was to remove the idle state from here and to just keep the 3 states here, loading, success, and error, and then have the fetch status of fetching, paused, and idle. And I thought it's a good change in version 4. And then it turns out I forgot one specific case, which was the enabled case, where you have enabled not filters or something, which made your query like conditionally disabled. And what happened in that situation is that, why can't I pass fit? Oh, it's, yeah, whatever. This doesn't really matter, let's revert that back. So what happened in this situation was, if the query was disabled, is that your query would also be in loading state. And this tipped off like I got lots of complaints about this. Like, if my query is disabled and it's not fetching, why is it in loading state? Because loading is associated with a loading spinner, and I tried to explain that the state doesn't tell you anything about if your query function is running or not. This is also in the version 4 docs. The status tells you something about the data. Success means I have data. Error means I have an error. And the third state means literally everything else. I have no data yet because, you know, my promise hasn't resolved. Maybe the promise hasn't even started yet, but, you know, there is no data. And to look at the status of what you're fetching is you have to actually look at the fetch status, because all of those combinations are possible. You have like those 3 and those 3, so you have 9 possible combinations of states. All of them are something that your application can be in. So this is like with stale while we validate and conditionally enabled queries and stuff like that. It does get complicated in terms of how many possible states you theoretically have to check. But that's just as a side effect of the power that React query has in terms of what it can do. But anyway, it kind of like pissed a lot of people off that why is my query loading if it isn't really loading? And yeah, especially because we also returned like a custom flag, so we had like an isLoading flag and so on. So if you did like if my query.isLoading, and then you handle the loading state in there, and then you would basically also get like this infinite loading spinner because you didn't really have the check for the idle up front that you would need for that. So what are we doing in version 5? Well, we're not really conceptually changing that thing. We're just renaming something. So this is something that I didn't do initially, but probably should have done, is I renamed this loading state to pending. And this is something we're doing in version 5 for both queries and mutations, because a mutation is also like, why is a mutation loading, right? A mutation is just, you know, going on. It's not really loading something. Loading means, at least in the way I interpreted it, is that loading means it's getting something, but a mutation is the opposite. It's sending something somewhere. So also when Kevin said happy to hear it's not loading on mutations anymore, a mutation being in loading state is kind of weird. Like a mutation is pending, and also in this case a query is pending. And if you check the status for pending here, then you would actually see that my query.data at this point must be defined. So we take away, oh come on, let me just see, error and pending. What remains is success. Wait a second, this should work. Maybe I ruined it, but this is like the normal, why is this number or undefined? This is number and error. Because I did change something with the overloads yesterday. Maybe there's pending, there's error. Okay. Maybe this is just the sandbox here. Let me just double check this quickly, because this needs to work. If success, with success it goes to number, but with error and pending it's like a discriminated union. If you check 2 of them, the third one that remains must be later. Oh, I think I ruined it. Let me just let me just try something. Method random greater 0.5 undefined 5. Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Interesting. I think I ruined something with the types. I'm going to open an issue for myself. And if I return undefined, it works. No, if I return 5, it works, obviously. Yeah, and then we have no pending state. Okay, I need to look into this. Oh, you're right, Kevin. Yeah. I guess I'm getting tired. I guess it's not a bug. Let's put this in a function. You're right. If I don't put an else around it, then obviously I need an early return. Maybe I didn't ruin it. So let's do return null. Return null. Yeah, you're right. Thank you so much. I didn't see that. I thought because I made a change like 2 days ago, I kind of ruined the discriminated types, but I didn't. Okay, that's cool. So yeah, what's the issue here? Yeah, okay, never read. Anyways, yeah, that's true. You need, like, if you return something, then TypeScript eliminates the paths, and then the data is undefined. Okay, so that actually works as it should. Okay, so we've renamed it to pending, and the idea behind this is that with pending, it's kind of like, it means that the promise is pending, right? Or it's kind of like associated with the promise much more, and it's not associated with actually like a loading spinner or loading something like loading used to be giving that association. And of course, with all of these states, you are getting a boolean. So we have is pending, we have is success, and we have is error. But conveniently, what I've also kept, and this is kind of like the change that's hopefully going to be the one for the better, is that we also have an is loading flag. Because in version 4, we kind of, to mitigate the situation, I introduced a flag that's called is initial loading, and it's still here in version 5, but I've deprecated it right away. It's just there to make the migration path easier. Is initial loading and is loading now do the same thing. So is loading is actually just is pending and is fetching. So it combines the pending and the fetching state, which means I have no data yet and I'm fetching, which is usually the initial load that you have. So if you're doing a check for if is loading and you're displaying a loading spinner, return loading spinner, then you're actually fine, even if you're using the enabled flag. So this will still work as you'd expect it to. If you're using if you're checking for pending, then you still have to be careful with enabled, because pending just means I have no data, and with enabled you also have no data. But if you're using these loading, and I think this is what many people were doing that were complaining about this, I'm actually checking for is loading, and is loading means for many people we are doing a fetch. Then that was kind of like unintuitive, but now, and that's what was the is initial loading was trying to fix. But the better naming obviously is loading, because we now have is loading and is pending. And I hope from that naming we can see that is pending checks if we have no data. Could also be because of enabled, but is loading is only because you're actually making a request. But of course, the drawback of this is if we look at the TypeScript discrimination, and we're going to need data here, and then we're going to need to, because I started to destruct the stuff, and then let's check for is error here. So if we're only checking for is loading and is error, our data will still be undefined, because is loading does not discriminate like is pending does, because it actually falls through if you're not making a request, if you are in this disabled state. So if you want the discriminated union check, you need is pending to do that. If you're using is loading, you kind of only check for actually making a request, and then the discrimination doesn't work. Apart from all of this, my suggestion is actually to do something entirely different. What I would do is always this. Like something like this. I would always check for data first and do something like, if I have data, I want to show data, and then I can do some check for is error, and then otherwise in the end I can maybe return the loading spinner or whatever. So and then or I do is loading and is error, and at the end I can return whatever I want. And I also have a blog post on this. It's quite an old one about status checks, where I'm actually also explaining this, and whoops, there it is. And yeah, also doing it like that, and showing the trade-offs. yeah, I actually need to update my blog to also explain like how it is in version 5. Going to be more updates in those blog posts than actual content at the very end. But yeah, things change and we need to keep these up to date. So there are also other reasons why checking for data first is a good idea. It's in the blog post, so if you haven't read that yet, give it a read. Okay. Right, that was it about the change of status loading to pending and is loading to is pending. Yeah, and that's actually all of the change. I think we went through all of the changes, which is pretty much. I didn't really get to talk about the optimistic updates. We did talk about the limited infinite queries with the new max pages option, and oh, we didn't talk about combine unused queries. Well, yeah, just so many, and the suspense hooks we talked about, and I didn't talk about the experimental Next.js plugin. There are so many things that I could still talk about, but it's getting late here in Austria, and I'm probably going to maybe just do another stream next week on Friday. Oh no, I can't do Friday, but anyway, another stream about all the missing things. Oh, I did talk about optimistic updates already in another stream. Could be, but there's also like an example in version 5 that actually shows how the optimistic updates work in the new way, and it's also done in TypeScript. And if you haven't seen the new way to do it, I think it's pretty good. And I've also rewritten the documentation. Oh, and we have new dev tools. I don't know if we've mentioned, I think I've mentioned this a bunch of times already. Can I make this bigger? How do I make this bigger? Okay. This is all Arian's work. He's our solid query maintainer, and we now have agnostic dev tools for version 5. We're also using the new logo that we have here for the dev tools. It's the TanStack logo if you haven't seen that. And functionality wise, it's all pretty much the same. It's just you know, with a bit of a UI update, and it's framework agnostic, which is pretty cool because it means the dev tools themselves are actually written in solid.js. So we no longer have, we do still have React Query dev tools, and it's still its own package, but under the hood it uses the Query dev tools, which is like framework agnostic thing, and it means that solid.js and also Svelte, if they want to, can use and Vue.js, they can use the same dev tools without having to write their own dev tools. I think I have announced it on Twitter somewhere when we had the new dev tools, and it's a pretty cool achievement because it means we can give the same dev tools to every framework without having to rewrite them every time. And yeah, we're using the TanStack logo here, and just because Tana announced it today, we have merchandising on the TanStack, tanstack.com/merch, where you can get t-shirts and hoodies with the new logos and everything. I already ordered 2 today, so going to put that link in here as well if you want to buy some merch with the new TanStack query logo, which I really like, and it's also like the same logo we're using here now for this. So there's that. Yeah. All right. I think I'm going to draw the line here for today. If there are still things that you want me to talk about, then reach out to me. I can do another stream on the things that I haven't talked about today. If you have any questions regarding anything, reach out to me on Twitter, reach out to me on Discord, open a discussion on GitHub, and I'm happy to talk about all the things there. All right. Have a good night, everyone, and have a good weekend. See ya.